Take the 101 local bus from central Kuala Lumpur, and in just under 2 hours of heavy traffic, you'll arrive in the relatively small coastal town of Kuala Selangor. For me, the main attraction is the presence of the 800-acre Kuala Selangor Nature Park. This is a great place to see and film really close up the silvered leaf monkey. To enjoy watching their antics, go to the link at the end of this video. The other attraction is the presence of a large area of mangrove swamp with 13 different kinds of mangrove trees. Those green leaves in the foreground are mangrove seedlings. Once the tide goes out, as seen here, huge areas of bare mud are exposed. That was a white-collared kingfisher. Mud doesn't look very appetising, but it does support huge quantities of animal life, especially crabs. The most typical crabs in any mangrove ecosystem are fiddlers. The males are easily recognised by the possession of one hugely enlarged claw. Note how it uses the smaller claw to feed mud into its mouth. This mud contains huge quantities of microscopic food particles that maintain the whole ecosystem. That tiny yellow crab on the left is a much smaller species of fiddler crab. The males use their enlarged claw both for signalling and for fighting one another. At this point, I was joined by a school party studying the mangrove ecosystems. Unlike many fiddler crabs, the males of this species seem to devote a great deal of their time to combat. This basically involves prolonged pushing and shoving matches which can go on for several minutes. Sometimes there's a brief mid-match break and they both devote time to feeding, but then it all kicks off again. After a considerable amount of time spent watching fiddler combat in many parts of the world, I totally fail to see what it's all about. Neither crab ever seems to gain any particular advantage, and there's seldom, if ever, any female present to be fighting over. So why do they spend so much time and energy actually doing it? I reckon in all there must be at least 10 or more species of crabs feeding on the mud. But they're not alone. Another variety of living flesh, derived directly from feeding on mud, belongs to the blue-spotted mudskipper. All of its feeding activity takes place out in the open air at low tide. Hauling itself forward on its pectoral fins, it moves its head from side to side, scraping up mud into its mouth. Then it pauses for a few seconds while it filters out the food particles. The males are famously aggressive towards one another. These two are pondering whether or not they're going to have a fight. In the end, they decide, yes, let's go for it. But it never really develops into mouth-to-mouth combat. It just gets as far as signalling each other with their raised dorsal fins and their fanned tail. But not all mudskippers feed harmlessly on mud. That giant mudskipper, lurking in its own little private pool on the left, is probably trying to figure out whether it will manage to grab the blue-spotted feeding on the left. Giant mudskippers feed on other animals, including blue-spotted mudskippers. Also, at low tide, the giants spend far less time out of the water. Instead, they tend to remain in small pools that they themselves excavate. For much of the day, just the bulbous eyes and the top of the head are exposed to the open air. You can see why they're unwilling to expose any more of their skin. Just the small area that is exposed attracts large numbers of tiny flies, which are obviously an irritant. The fish regularly dips into the water to wash them off, usually without much effect. I'm not sure what these flies are. They're far too small for mosquitoes, Another biting fly that it could be would be the sandfly, but they don't look right for that either. Having them constantly crawling over your eyes is clearly not very pleasant. In the end, it's obviously just had enough. When on land, it conspicuously inflates its mouth cavity with large gulps of air. There. And there. Here, the mouth cavity is particularly clearly inflated. The giant mudskipper is particularly abundant and easy to observe at Kuala Selangor. Everything you've seen so far, and everything you're about to see, was all filmed from an extensive concrete walkway into the mangroves. While filming all this, I was regularly entertained by the raucous calls of a family of golden-backed woodpeckers. Many of the mangroves were in poor condition. Their trunks were riddled with beetle borings. These larvae provided a regular supply of food for the woodpeckers. The white-coloured kingfisher is another noisy mangrove resident. The long-tailed macaque has earned itself a bad reputation for its aggressive behaviour when searching for food around human habitations, where it can be a real problem as a thief. Here in the mangroves it's in its natural home. This particular group has no interaction with humans other than as casual visitors like myself. They're going about the difficult daily business of looking for something edible, including crabs, hence the alternative name, crab-eating macaque. Much as I would love to have filmed one catching a crab, I only managed to get them feeding on plants. This big male macaque, who was actually the group leader, has found himself a food bonanza, an old coconut. And what's more, he knows just how to gain access to the nutritious kernel inside by bashing the coconut against a big log. This smaller individual is using its jaws to tackle this particularly tough nut and get at the black seeds inside. This juvenile would clearly love to get a share, but this is not its lucky day. As in most long-tailed macaque groups, there are plenty of babies of various sizes and ages. From its rather sparse amount of short hair and abundance of bare skin, this is clearly a very young baby. But like all macaque babies, it's full of life and eager to explore the world around it. That's what it's going to look like in just a few weeks' time. But at the moment, it seems a little fearful of its would-be playmate and cuddles up to its mother. Clouds of mosquitoes hung around the macaques, and the baby was often scratching. One way of escaping the mosquitoes was to take a refreshing dip in a nearby area of fresh water. Most of the group really enjoyed playing here, both adults and juveniles. One of their favourite tricks was to climb 2 or 3 metres up a tree and then jump into the water with a great big splash. Macaques are pretty smart. This one decides to surprise his playmate by sneaking up underwater. These play sessions were obviously so enjoyable that they could last up to an hour. In a transition zone between salty mangrove and freshwater swamp, there was a relatively small area where a beautiful blue fiddler crab was at home. This strikingly lovely female is daintily feeding mud into her mouth from her 2 front claws. Males, on the other hand, can only gather the mud with 1 claw, their other grotesquely enlarged claw being much too big for the task. You don't see dragonflies in the mangroves. The water there is far too salty for the larvae, but they do begin to appear on the edge of the freshwater swamp. After many hours of exposure to the heat of the day, the mud in the mangroves and all its living denizens were finally covered by the incoming tide. After a long, hot, sweaty day filming in the mangroves, I went back to park headquarters. Just in front of the visitor centre, I was fortunate to see this plantain squirrel. This species is rare in dense natural forest, but becomes very common around man-made environments. It can be particularly abundant in large leafy gardens. Malaysia is keen on educating its school children about natural environments, and school parties are common in Kuala Selangor.